So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, delighted to be joined this week by our research fellow, Richard Schenk. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
And delighted to see returning to the podcast, Mick Hume, the editor of EuropeanConservative.com and a visiting research fellow at MCC.
Hello.
This week on the podcast, we're going to be taking stock of a wild bumper ride of Trump tariff-related madness. We're going to look into the shocking new report about NGO transparency published by an EU audit court. And finally, going to be taking a look at Germany, where at the same time as the coalition agreement's finally been inked, it looks like the AfD are back on the rise. Okay, coming first to tariffs. We talked about this last week, but so much has happened on tariff-related news in the last 7 days. We really have to come back to it. Again, it's hard to know where to start at one level because we've gone from enormous tariffs across all of the world to suddenly a kind of almost shock announcement yesterday that they were rolling back the tariffs to 10% on all the countries except China, which has left lots of people now saying this is the deal of the century. What a master plan to go after China. But this followed a week of absolute market meltdown. We saw stocks collapsing. We saw bonds rising. And a lot of people have suggested that actually Trump has kind of had his hand forced on this issue. But Mick, the first thing to say is a lot of people are just trying to say this is just chaos.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's just kind of making it up as he goes along. Do you think there's some plan to this, or do you think they're reacting to events?
Well, I think, as you rightly say, Jacob, there is this tendency to say, oh, this kind of swings and roundabouts is just Donald Trump. It's got this crazy personality, gets up one day and decides to do the opposite of what he did the day before. And there's even an article today published in the British Conservative magazine, The Spectator, which written by a former Tory MP who just says, or maybe Trump's just bonkers, mad. Maybe that's what the explanation for it all is, that he just needs to be locked up. I think this attempt to pin this down to being to do with Trump's personality, which obviously is the public face of it, is just wrong. It just minimises the problem. It misses the fact that what Trump is doing is bringing to the surface trends which have been happening in the world economy for a long time. The breakdown of the globalization system, the forging of new blocks of which China is a central player in, and the assertion of national interests rather than real national interests rather than fictional global ones. So he's kind of accelerated and brought to the surface trends which have been happening for a long time, and protectionism is the inevitable consequence of those things. Everybody trying to protect their own interests. So he may have brought these tariffs in. He may have suspended them now for however long he says, 3 months or whatever. But I think the trends which have been set in motion are going to continue, and it's really wrong to think that to try and minimise it, to say it's just Trump, because the EU is as protectionist as anybody in today's world market.
And Richard, one of the things that I was scratching my head about over the last week was the fact that nobody seemed to be actually taking Trump at his word at all. Trump said repeatedly, and he said, people have rung me up and offered zero tariffs, and I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in redressing the trade deficit that the United States has in goods with other countries. And it seemed that time and time again, people weren't taking that element of what he said seriously. So is it possible to draw from that there is a kind of underlying rationale, however kind of madly at some points it seems it's being implemented, but there is a kind of underlying rationale, and if so, what is that?
The Trump administration seems to be really determined to get industry back to the US and this is a true strategic issue. If we don't see it from Europe, but even in the US, the capabilities of the defense industries declined over the last decades. So there is a serious question, for example, if there's an all-out war with China, which is the worst case, of course, but you have to prepare for that, if the US industry could outproduce the Chinese one. Because obviously all this industry in a global scale in the last decades went to China. So you have to rethink all these trade policies. And just as Mick said, the Trump administration's actions are just a pinnacle of a decade-long development. Globalization pinnacled around 2008, so 15 years ago. Since then, it's in a constant decline. First, it was slow. Now it's increasing. Actually, it was the Obama administration that sabotaged the World Trade Organization first by not sending judges to the court of arbitration. So since then, the World Trade Organization is increasingly defunct because many cases are not settled anymore in the WTO. And the Trump administration learned from this that now there is an opportunity
we need to act. We have a good conditions to implement these tariff policies because we have low unemployment because of the demographic change. We have also low energy prices that shield us from other developments. That is already driving industry back to the US since some years. Now with the tariff policy, we can increase this trend even further.
And Mick, one of the kind of key points of debate over the last week was the kind of horror that some people had as stocks were collapsing, bonds were rising, these kind of things. And whilst on the one hand, you don't want to say that people should just cause economic chaos for the sake of it, it seems very oddly from lots of people on the liberal left who are saying this means the end of Trump if bonds or collapse or stocks collapse. It's a very there is no alternative approach.
Completely, and I think that this goes back to your previous questions about people not just believe Trump can't mean this. He can't really be going to do this. Because we've had this world order since the Second World War and it's been expanding and liberal and lovely, and nobody could possibly shake it up in this way. Seriously, he must be mad. He is determined to shake it up and to bring this into the service. And I think your point about the markets is the same. Oh, it's the same as happened to that Tory Prime Minister. He'll be brought down by what happens in he's not going to be brought down by what happens in the stocks and shares. And people are going to have to get used to the fact that, the key word to describe what's happened in the markets over the last week has been volatility. It's plummeting one day, going up the next day, according to what you're going to have to get used to that because volatility is the kind of key word of our age now, and it's going to be that in politics, in international relations, and in economic affairs. And these people just have to wake up to the fact that it's the complacency of all these economic experts that no, you can't do that. No one could possibly do that. That couldn't. Oh, it's going to happen.
And Richard, coming to China, I mean, the one of the aims seems to be very much to, or now people are saying the aim is clearly that you want to isolate China on the international stage. And it's kind of interesting because China's almost playing like a status quo power in this. I mean, China said they're going to take this to the WTO. You were just talking about defunct, like from a different era. That is, they released the pages long analysis about the international order and how they're going to, how they believe this kind of undermines the international order. It's interesting that the retrenchment of an America First position puts China in this almost position of being the last player standing defending kind of globalization.
It's crazy times, but I mean, one of the main contributors to this peak in globalization in the 1990s and 2000s was that China opened up to the world stage, joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and now obviously the Chinese are pretty smart people. If they do something, they do it for a reason. So if they are in the WTO, they will obviously protect it. So we see it if China actually participates in international organizations, they take it usually quite seriously, which makes them kind of like an odd outlier nowadays when the old proponents of these international organizations like the US or the European Union are actually getting more and more wary of these organizations. But I mean, it's just how things progress, and we will see how it will develop in the future.
Here in Brussels, we should recognise the hypocrisy of the EU's position in relation to all this, that suddenly they want to pretend that they're the champions of free trade in complaining about what Donald Trump's been doing with tariffs. The EU is highly protectionist in terms of the European economy, but what it's done in recent years is to present its protectionism as being about climate change, saving the planet, raising environmental standards. And so protectionism and putting tariffs on foreign cars and so on is okay as long as you can wrap it up in some kind of green rhetoric. When Trump does it as naked national interest, which is what protectionism is about, then it's outrageous. I think we shouldn't take the EU at the face value either on these matters.
And so whichever way you look at it on the tariffs thing, whether you think this is someone flying by the seat of their pants or you think there's a kind of a grand strategy, it seems, doesn't it, Mick, that we're moving into a very different era, that the fundamentals of globalization have been challenged, and that one of those key enablers, i.e. the idea that everything would just leave America and America would just be a passive consumer nation, that that era over?
Yes, I think, it would be very premature to talk about a new world order because volatility and disorder is the order of the day. But what is clear is it's the end of that era. It's breaking down. That doesn't mean that international trade is going to stop. International trade is still at huge levels, but the rise of trading blocks, the use of protectionism, nations putting themselves their own national interests first, rather than going along with whatever they're told to do by in Davos and the World Economic Forum. That era is coming to an end, and that order is breaking down. And I think that is a dangerous and volatile situation. It's also offers the possibilities of all kinds of new changes that are for the better. And certainly it means that we're entering a new era of nation states, and every nation's got to look after themselves and not be following the orders of Brussels or the World Economic Forum or anybody else.
And the reappearance of rearmament. So this is everybody's thinking about rearming. The EU, USA, of course, Russia, China. We could go on with all the countries in the Middle East. It's not an arms race yet, but the importance of the defense sector is increasing day by day, and this is, on the long run, a dangerous development.
So something that really shocked many people in Brussels was the report from an otherwise obscure organization known as the Court of Auditors, who are in charge of looking into financial matters across the EU. They released a really blockbuster, by their standards. It's obviously still kind of couched in the language of EU technocrats, but by their standards, blockbuster report about the degree of the lack of transparency in NGO funding. Richard, this has obviously been a very big theme for us at MCC Brussels. We're publishing reports as fast as we can, trying to get to the bottom of it. But what did you kind of take from this report about the scale? And this was by an EU institution admitting how little information there is about the funding of NGOs.
I think the very underlying question in this case is that this report by the Court of Auditors actually points out very well. Why do we need NGOs in this scale? Like, why do we need NGOs to implement EU policies? We have thousands of civil servants in the EU Commission, and not to speak about all the national and local governments who should also implement a lot of EU policies. Why do we even need these NGOs? First of all, we don't even know exactly what an NGO is, because every government entity has a different definition of NGOs. Often it's just a self-declaration of NGOs. And the second was that we don't have any kind of information on why these NGOs are getting so much government money. So, I mean, these are non-governmental organizations. At the same time, they are at the very heart of implementation of EU policies. So this actually points out that there's an almost symbiotic relationship between EU policies and NGOs. And we don't know exactly how it works, because the intricacies of these relationships are hidden very well in the public, from the public, because all these databases are not connected, all these definitions are not uniform, all these different budgetary positions are a bit contradictory. So this vagueness was created on purpose, and there is no political intention to create real transparency.
Yeah, and this is part and parcel of how they kind of have to operate, isn't it, Mick?
Yes. I mean, first of all, let's say chapeau, hats off to MCC Brussels, because they're well ahead of the curve on this subject with the fantastic reports that you published over the last month or so, before the auditors came out with this story. So I think that's real kudos. As Richard says, there's a deliberate policy here of you have these NGOs, you give them money. The EU knows what these NGOs are going to come back and say that they campaign for or support, or they've done a report which supports existing EU policies on migration or the Green Deal or whatever it is that Brussels wants to push. And then the EU is able to say, Brussels and the European Commission is able to say, well, we are following the advice of these independent campaigners who have raised these important issues. And it's all a self-perpetuating circle. And by giving these billions of euros to these organisations, which are not publicly accountable and have no democratic accountability, you can get away with it, and you can obscure where the money goes and all the rest of it. So that the fact that even the EU's own body now has to say this is a bit of a problem, the lack of transparency, that tells you that the actual problem is many times worse than that. Because for them to even go that far demonstrates the depth of the problem. And I think what we have to really come back to, which I think the point that the MCC made very well in the first place, is this is not simply a question of financial mismanagement or corruption. This is political corruption. This is a corruption of democracy. That's what these NGOs exist for, to get around the EU's lack of democratic authority and democratic support by doling out power and money to these NGOs and saying, this shows that we have the support of civic society for what we're doing in Brussels. And there's no democratic accountability involved in it. No voter ever voted for €1 to go to any of these organisations. So, and that's the real political nub of the problem, not simply financial mismanagement, but the corruption of democracy.
Yeah, completely. And Richard, I mean, give us. I know you spent a long time with some of these databases and trying to get to the bottom of it. Give us and our viewers a kind of a sense of what it really is like to try and navigate this maze. I mean, the report from the Court of Auditors talks about the fact that NGOs would be listed an NGO in one database, but listed not as an NGO in another. That there's non-information on how much money some of them received, even though you can tell they've received money. Give us a sense of what it's like trying to navigate these databases.
Well, how to begin with? So there are, for example, the EU has different kinds of management implementation. Some EU policies are directly managed by the EU only, but this is only a fraction. But most of the EU policies are actually in so-called shared management with the member states and local governments together. And in both types of management, the NGOs play a key role. But because these are, from a bureaucratic point of perspective, different types of management, we have different databases for them. And the same NGO might participate actually in both, but they will receive different metadata for one participating in one and different metadata for participating in the other column. So it's very, very hard to actually see how much overall EU money an NGO gets, even though we know that, under shared management in this, and then it's a further distributed across programs. So, for example, the LIFE program has a different database than the Horizon program, and then other. So it's even worse than that. There are also completely independent databases from this, like the funding and tenders portal. Somehow they are all connected. So often enough, you go in the very back. So you go in this section of the website and you can find the raw data. And then according to, if you use one part of the raw data and combine it from other database with the raw data from other, then you can make some connections. But it is very, very, very hard to find. And it's not, and often these raw data are not very well, not machine readable in a fashion that you can automatize this process, which is necessary with tens of thousands of entries, because you cannot do this by hand. So this is what I meant by hiding stuff in public from the public. Actually, on paper, you can access this data, but you cannot process this data in any reasonable fashion.
Yeah, and Mick, I mean, just before the Court of Auditors published its report, there was a kind of signed letter by hundreds of NGOs who were complaining about the extra scrutiny that they were receiving. One of my favorite lines from the letter they all signed was that actions of right-wing groups were undermining civil society, whereas actually it's these groups have really undermined the very concept of civil society.
Absolutely, yeah. And they have made a mockery of it, the very idea of civil society, that they are simply the kind of provisional militant wing of the political elites in Brussels. That's what they exist to be, the kind of radical voice of the Brussels bureaucracy. And they've completely destroyed any idea of civil society being anything more than that. It's just state-funded, EU-funded, glove puppet organisations who are acting on behalf of the EU elite. So the idea that they should protest about this being a right-wing attack on democracy in Europe is an outrageous inversion of the truth.
And in typical EU fashion, Richard, I mean, the Court of Auditors proposed some remedies, but that basically amounted to saying, we should probably get around to looking at some of these databases properly by 2029 or something.
Yeah, I mean, the Court of Auditors can only make recommendations, and they point very much at current EU legislation that is already in force, that reads like this, that, we should create transparency. And then the second section of the article is like, we should create transparency by issuing an assessment with other recommendations until 2029. That is so it's basically pushing. There are no really firm policies in place that are aimed to create transparency. Only commitments on paper, and I mean, this is done on purpose. It's quite clearly done on purpose.
Now, coming back to Germany, which we discussed a lot on the podcast because things are moving so quickly there. The two things happened this week that were kind of almost related to each other at the moment. One, you finally had the signing of a coalition agreement led by that's going to see Merz become Chancellor of the Republic. And at the same time, you had, for the first time, I think, in a national poll, you've got the AfD now leading in a reputable national poll. And actually, these things are actually related, because what we've seen in the negotiations for the coalition agreement is that the CDU-CSU appear to have given up or conceded on so much to their coalition partners that their promises of finally taking immigration seriously, reviving the economy, and so on, kind of ring hollow. Richard, what's in the coalition agreement, and why did the AfD kind of get this historic mark in the polls?
To be honest, I would like to have the Scholz government back again, because it is almost the same policies. No big difference. It's only the most wildest things that the Scholz government has done have been curved back. But on top of that, they have taken on this giant debt package already at the very beginning of the government formation. And what we see currently is, both in policies and in personnel, the revamp of the Merkel fourth cabinet. There is no policy divergence at all, no reforms, no ambitious reforms. Some of the most wildest policies that really backfired were cut back, like the idea that you should create basic income. Just Germany went in this direction, backfired terribly. Now they want to change at least this one, but there is no fundamental reforms at all. And I mean, they often enough, this coalition agreement reads like that. They see the problem, and then they just ignore it and continue with the current policies. So in economic policy terms, they often say, "Oh, we are in a terrible crisis. We need to do a lot," but always with the undertone, "It was not our fault. It is Trump, Russia, China, COVID, whatever." And then they say, "Oh, okay, we have very high taxes on businesses, so businesses are leaving the country. We will decrease corporate taxes by 1 percentage points in 2028. So this is the solution." So also we have very high energy prices. What's the solution? They want to give more subsidies to corporations that consume more energy. So they don't tackle the fundamental issue that why are the energy prices very high in the very beginning? Because they have created an artificial decrease in supply of energy by getting rid of nuclear energy. This is completely ignored. Just, we have a problem, just let's throw money at it. They can do this because they have already issued this release of the constitutional debt brake. Now they are swimming in money, and whenever there's a problem, they're just throwing money at it. With the pension reform, the same. They didn't do a pension reform. They just say, the pensions are going to stay the same, and whenever there are not enough social contributions to the system, they will just throw more tax money at it, because they now can have more money because of the debt brake in the entire system. And this is going to, people are not stupid. Usually there is a honeymoon phase after a government formation period where people reward the winners of the previous elections with good results in the polls, at least in Germany. This is not at all the case. So actually they have these results are even more remarkable. They have the CDU-CSU is losing in the polls, and the AfD is now even number one in the first polls, which is absolutely amazing given this honeymoon period. I am pretty much not convinced that in the next weeks we will not see a backlash on this, because their entire hope was that they want to get finished with this negotiations as quickly as possible, but it's not working at all.
Yeah, and Mick, having seen and listened, you hear when Richard lays out how much of a disaster this coalition group is, it's not surprising that the AfD is suddenly surging.
Absolutely. I really agree with Richard's point. And I think what it shows above all else is that, because if we think of Germany as being the heart of the European Union, this is what European politics is now about. That above all else, whatever they say in election campaigns, whatever they lie to the electorate about, in the end, the political parties of the old European establishment are clinging together for life. They are clinging together against the storm of public opinion that's going around, and they will do anything to maintain their hold on power. And so the CDU has agreed to a continuation of the previous coalition's government, and it's no accident that in those consequences, in those circumstances, their poll rating is now, I think, at a historic low. 24% is pretty much the lowest that you would ever find the CDU being in any election or poll in modern Germany. And like politics everywhere, the consequence of this is that the gap between the political class and the public is growing. And the honeymoon period that Richard talked about are getting shorter and shorter. In the Labour government in Britain had a honeymoon period of about 2 weeks. The new German government's honeymoon was over before they'd even consummated their marriage. Right, their popularity had collapsed before they'd even formed a government. So this is the way the wind is blowing in European politics. We're going to see an increase of support for populist anti-establishment parties. Thank goodness for that. And we are going to see the political establishment clinging together and trying to combat that with legal measures. Not by winning political arguments, but by trying to ban their opponents. So it's really striking that if you look at the coalition statement, the new government says basically their priority together, the SPD and the CDU, supposedly the left and right, their priority together is to combat the enemies of democracy, i.e. far right, in inverted commas, extremism, the AfD and populism. That is their political priority. And they'll do that through the courts, through the constitutional court, through any legal measure that they can find, as the French courts have just done to Marine Le Pen. And we can expect to see a lot more of this.
Yeah, and to take one example, Richard, immigration policy, asylum policy has obviously been a huge factor. And I was reading, there was one mainstream news report that I thought captured it, inadvertently captured it very well. They said the CDU had entered with very strong demands about pausing asylum and blah, blah, blah. And then through the coalition agreement, they'd managed to water them down. But they were still left with some strong rhetoric in the coalition agreement. That was it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one example of this was the family reunification program for people with subsidiary protection. So mostly coming from Syria and Afghanistan. These people were not recognized as political refugees. So they are not refugees officially, but they cannot be brought back to their countries. The previous Scholz government allowed for these people to bring their families to Germany, which obviously will lead to for them to stay in the country on the long run. Now the CDU campaign with the stop to this family reunification program, but now what they ended up with, for the next 2 years there is not going to be family reunification, which is just saying to all these people, hold on for two more years and then you can bring your family to Germany. So this is just, this is not even any change. It's just kicking the can down the road maybe a bit. And on the other side, it's very interesting, especially around migration, but also on other issues. We see that the left rising, the left party is rising, and also the Greens are moving to the left again. So we see a very strong radical left emerging again, because this political polarization has two sides. And especially around migration, so many people grew up with the belief that that Germany is racist and colonialist and whatever. So that this certain groups are very much into this. And if we continue on this trend, rising AfD on the right, rising left on the political left, then Germany is headed full on into a France scenario where we have 3 blocks that are almost equal in size, and the country is completely ungovernable.
Yeah, and it was interesting to note that the degree to which for the SPD the migration issues become not just a kind of policy objective, but a real principal value that has to be studied. And they were celebrating the fact that they'd included some language saying that Germany is always a welcoming home for migrants. That will always be one of our key values. But Mick, I wanted to zoom in on Merz just for a second, because aside from the fact that he seems to have kind of conceded everything before the coalition talks even really began, and so went from being supposedly hard migration rhetoric as one example to conceding anything. But at the same time, he's in the classic vein of so many European leaders, he's now positioning his strengths lying as elsewhere, as being a leader of Europe, as if it's too boring to be the leader of Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And the very idea that this, technocratic non-entity is somehow going to be the strong man of Europe, the leader of Europe, is such a reflection on the paucity of talent, the weakness of the political class that someone like Merz could even be suggested as being, the new pin-up boy in Brussels. Shows what a lack of leadership there is in Europe. It shows why someone like von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has been able to ride roughshod over the national leaders, not because she's got any innate strengths, but because of the weakness of the political leader she's dealing with. And he's the latest in a long line of those. And as you say, the answer to this is strut about on the world stage as much as possible. Keir Starmer wants to invade Ukraine. He can't protect Britain's borders, but he's going to send the non-existent British army to Ukraine. And Merz wants to be the new Mr. Europe, competing with Macron for who's going to be the latest little Napoleon. And it's a real reflection of the fact that they have got nothing to say to their own electorates and nothing to offer their own electorates, that they see this kind of posturing internationally. But as Donald Trump has demonstrated to them, when you call their bluff, there is nothing to it. They are just playing toy soldiers, really, on the international stage. And they're not leaders that we should look to save Europe for the future.
It was actually the former chair of the Greens, Ricarda Lang, who dubbed the term BlackRock for the new government, because Merz was a former BlackRock manager, and also he in German it makes a lot of sense. So it's black stands for the CDU-CSU, and Rot is like for the red ones, the Social Democrats. So she suggested it's not the Grand Coalition anymore, but the BlackRock coalition. I think she had a point in this case. Yeah.
So thanks for joining us on the MCC Brussels podcast. As ever, if you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, follow us on YouTube, or if you listen to us on your Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure you follow us there. Leave a comment if you're watching us on YouTube. Let us know what you'd like us to tackle in the future. But for now, that's it from the MCC Brussels podcast. Thanks so much to Richard for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Mick, a pleasure to have you again.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.